Today, we're tasting a bunch of exciting whiskeys with Randal Bird. I will let Randal introduce himself in just a few minutes. But we have a pretty full agenda, as it has been the case for the last few tasting kits. We have 6 different selections today. This time, we are tasting a portfolio of a company called Latitude Beverage Company, and probably doesn't really mean much to most of you, although I would venture to say most of you probably have heard at least about a couple of these brands that are kind of fall under this umbrella. Probably the most recognizable brand, especially if you're a fan of single barrels, would be Copper and Cask. Again, I'll let Randal talk about each of those samples separately, but we're going to be tasting 3 different Copper and Cask samples here today. 2 of them are from our own selections. One actually went on sale today for our premium members and is going to be available for everyone else starting Monday. And then we're going to be tasting also some of the what we call core expressions from the Latitude Beverage Company. And there are a few expressions that kind of fall under that umbrella. We'll have Horse Bourbon, which is their flagship right now in terms of bourbon. We'll taste very tasty Irish whiskey, which we don't get to do normally. And as a surprise, there's a gather and hunt, and there is a backstory to that, which Randal will get into as well. So with that being said, let me stop sharing my screen, Randal, and feel free to jump in.
I work with a company, Latitude Beverage, and Latitude Beverage has a wine side that's fairly famous, but distributed through a lot of parts of the United States, called 90 Plus Cellars. And about 3 years ago, they started their spirits division and had me work with a lot of the brands for the whiskey, developing the Copper and Cask systems, but also representing Wheel Horse and Northcross Irish whiskey, which we're about to taste tonight as well. I've been in the industry for about 30 years. I've worked for almost every company that you could name in Scotland, Taiwan, Canada, Ireland, Kentucky, United States, all over the place. So I'm pretty happy to have landed here with this company and excited to share some of the tasting with you. All right. So first of all, if you haven't been to the warehouse, it is quite hot in here. Right now, we're at over 95 degrees and probably close to 70% humidity. So I pardon the, but I have to shut the fans off because you can't hear the audio. And I thought we would start our kind of tasting with Northcross Irish. I'm going to hold up the bottle. And this is our Northcross Irish whiskey. And I'm going to pour myself a little sample so I can taste along with you. But one of the reasons I brought up the visual aid is that Irish whiskey as a category is probably not as popular as a lot of the American single barrels or single malts from Scotland. So behind me is kind of a visual aid. But up until the 80s, there were only about 3 major distilleries making whiskey out of Ireland, and they were New Middleton down in County Cork, and that's where Jameson, Redbreast, and a lot of those brands come out of. The other one, the oldest licensed distillery in the world, Old Bushmills, up here in Northern Ireland, and then another distillery called Cooley, which was developed by John Teasing Sr. That was purchased and kind of broke up some of the brands and distributed them. In the end, the sons got Teasing, which many people are familiar seeing it on the shelves. But the Northcross is coming from John Teasing Sr., the father and founder of a lot of the renaissance of Irish whiskeys, at his distillery called Great Northern, right here. And just before you cross into Northern Ireland, which is the darker green on the map. So Northcross, it's just before, it's at the crossroads between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, but right on the coast in Dundalk, and that is where John Teasing Sr. is making the product. Also on this visual aid, if you kind of look over here, what's fairly typical when people talk about Irish whiskey is they talk about triple distillation. They're looking for a lighter, slightly sweeter style with not a lot of the heavy or big tasting notes. And so they do that typically by doing 3 distillations, or if it's a column still, purifying it to a higher proof strength than we're typically seeing in the United States with bourbon. So it's a different animal. It can use the same type of grains. They typically don't specify a mash bill. And what you're going to see as one of the laws is that you can't distill the distillate to above, you probably can't see this, 94.8%. Much higher than that, you're getting a neutral grain spirit or a vodka type taste with no flavor or aroma. But unlike a lot of the bourbon that goes into the cask at 125 proof, this is much hotter in terms of what they can legally create their liquid with. And so that strips out a lot of the bigger flavors. We don't really talk about triple distillation. We look for a fairly pure product, but we do on the label say that it's triple wood. And triple wood is essentially our attempt to put as much flavor in for the whiskey fans around the world. And those three types of woods are ex-American bourbon, which is fairly standard in Ireland and Scotland even, a virgin charred American oak cask, and then the third, a sherry oloroso cask. And these are all aged separately and then mixed together to make the final batching for what we bottle. It is currently at 43% alcohol by volume, and we're looking for a richness or a sweetness in flavor, but not trying to get a lot of the heavy wood spice that you often find in a bourbon, for instance, although there are notes of that because of the virgin charred casks that we've gotten from the Americas, Quercus alba or white oak from the Americas. So I have a little bit in my glass, and I'm going to sit for a second to taste, but I'm not really interested in transparency in our whiskeys, but I am interested in education. The more you know, the better you drink. And so all that information should be on the bottle, and details of as much information as we can put, including the location of where we source. If there are mash bills, but the Irish one doesn't really lend itself to printing a mash bill. There's a minimum age to be called an Irish whiskey, and we're probably a year or two over that. So probably in the closer to the 3-4 year range. Although we do vertical batching, meaning that we'll take older stuff that has the flavors we're looking for. But the one thing that I kind of was thinking about after the presentation the other night is the hardest way to make whiskey is to make a production style that's at a good price point and that you're consistently getting good flavor. And this is on the shelf in the area of about 25 bucks a bottle at 43% alcohol by volume. So we're really proud of the batching, the small kind of runs that we do of this, the great price point, and at 43%, I'd like to move that up to 46, just because I like a little bit higher proof strength so that people can add ice or water or mix it to the way that they like it. But generally speaking, it's not chill filtered, and I think it's just a fantastic production product in an area that's crowded with a lot of stuff that gets bespoke or very expensive, if that makes sense. So I'm hoping everyone's enjoying it, but it's a different style that we're used to. And there's motion sensors in the warehouse, so the lights just dimmed because I'm not walking around over by the sensor. So any questions or anything I can answer?
Yeah, is this like Redbreast as far as the mash bill, malted and unmalted barley?
We do use a combination of malted, unmalted, and maize or corn in this particular recipe, but it is column distilled. So while I have an illustration showing how triple distillation moves things up to a higher proof strength incrementally, first one you'll get to 40%, then the second one this is all done in one shot on a column still. So and they typically will make different types of distillates, because in Ireland, when you hear the term blended, in Scotland, blended means more than one distillery. So if you have a blended malt, it's single malts from multiple distilleries. But in Ireland, blended means different distillates. So this is a blended Irish whiskey using perhaps a corn and an unmalted and malted mixture, but it's not done in terms of a mash bill like you typically think of bourbon. Typically, they're making different distillates at the same distillery and then mixing them together after they've aged them in different casks to create the flavor profile that we're looking for.
So I've asked people if they had their favorite Irish brand, right, that they're used to, or just their favorite. And a few people rattled off pretty impressive distilleries such as Redbreast, Ryder's Tears, which is interesting. It's not very well known distillery, but they certainly do make great whiskey. What else is here? Teasing, right? So to my palate, what I've noticed when I was drinking Northcross, first, I will concur with what Randall said. You can do a lot worse with $25. This whiskey is pretty flavorful. It might lack a punch. And again, I say that with the caveat because majority of the people on this call are barrel-proof drinkers, right? And so to them, it might be a bit, on a weaker side, but this doesn't take away from what the whiskey was meant to do, which would be, an entry point to a casual drinker whose palate isn't as trained as, let's say, ours. That being said, it's very different from your typical triple distilled Irish whiskey in that it has flavor. It has more to the character than your normal typical Irish whiskey would, at least to me. I would love to hear other people's opinions on this.
I would just point out that you're in kind of the rarefied atmosphere of looking at single barrel picks, allocated products. And so the first two that we're tasting, our Wheelhorse core brand and our Northcross, are not. They're a production style. We're very proud of them because we try and give the retailer as well as the customer a great price point and a good margin so that they can do business when a lot of that stuff is being squeezed out. And so as far as the 90 plus wine kind of collection, they tend to be value priced for within the category. And we're trying to, again, put out a great flavorful product. If you taste this against other things that are even $5, $10, $15 more expensive, this does very, very well. But if you're going to get into some of the later tastings that we're going to taste, I'm afraid that you're going to find that this is going to be kind of almost like a light. It's just not designed to be the same thing as that single expression, that allocated, hard to find, special cask finish, all the other stuff. It is trying to just be able to be on the shelf so people Irish whiskey at a reasonable price, which is very, very difficult to do, especially because a lot of the things are just a price play or make it as crazy as you possibly can so that you can try and get some buzz and sell it. So yeah, we started with this one because everything is going to get a little bit more intense in the flavor and in the proof strengths as well.
I would encourage anyone to blind taste this against, let's say, something like Proper 12, for example. Proper 12 is, very affordable whiskey. Lots of marketing dollars behind the brand, obviously, with the MMA fighter attached to it. But if you do it blindly, I would venture to say you'd pick probably Northcross 9 times out of 10.
Yeah. And a lot of these companies are going to be having a portion of their budget for advertising dollars. We self-distribute. So typically, there's no second tier adding additional 20, 30 points into the cost. And on top of that, we don't have a big advertising budget. So almost everything is going back to the retailer or for a price conscious sell to the customer. So as we move forward, I think we saw some comments the other night, and I'm very proud, but this is much harder to do this on a regular basis without taking massive price increases, without trying to do like a lot of like wackadoodle stuff. Redbreast has been mentioned. It's one of my favorites. I've had the 25, I've had the younger stuff, I've had the LaSalle, which is one of my favorites as well. But again, you're taking their core brand and then you can get into these kind of rarefied atmosphere of something that's special for the consumer. And that's not really what this core brand is about.
Jesse says that for under $30, this is quite good Irish whiskey. Would be great as a daily drinker when you don't want something high proof, and totally agree with that.
Yeah. Summertime, mixing it with a little ginger or ginger ale, ginger beer. It's delightful. But it's not trying to be the heavier malted product or peated products that you can find just 60 miles that way. All right, I think we'll get into the bourbon. And the bourbon one is our Wheelhorse. And again, this is a production style. So I'm going to hold up the bottle and after I pour myself a sample, and I'll talk about some of the statistics, but all of this is on the bottle. So as I hold it up here, you're going to see it's 101 proof, non-chill filter, no color added. They are batched. So each time we do a batch, we note the number of the batch, and you can actually see the batch numbers change in your marketplace, or you can collect by the batches. But almost no other production run is doing it with a batch system. Part of that is because we bottle in the warehouse behind me, and we can do special editions. And I'm going to hold this up, but it's not in your kit. And this is our toasted oak version. And by the holiday, we hope to have a rum cask finish version, all with different batch numbers. And we're looking to make this in a partnership with the Green River Distillery in Owensboro, Kentucky, the farthermost west distillery on the Bourbon Trail. It is the old Medley Distillery from back in the day, but it is KSPDY, I think 10 or 15. We also put that on the bottle. But a lot of old pedigree in this distillery. Now Green River is trying to make a little bit of a play, and we've started to include the DSP number on the more current bottle. But it is made and aged entirely in Kentucky, and then we select certain barrels. I decide what the batch is going to be. They mix that together, and then they send it to us in some totes, stainless typically, at which point we bottle it here in the facility in Rhode Island. So this isn't a backdrop behind me. If I move this, because we're done with the Irish, you can kind of see that this is my office and my workspace. People have been to this warehouse from your group, and I think they had a pretty good time, but there's about 500 barrels here. And this is mostly the ones that you see are going to be for the copper and cask, which we're going to taste in just a bit. However, there are some wheel horse and some different aging, different batching projects that we're doing. So we'll do some special editions of this. Currently, as this bottle stands, we're at 4 years or older on all the product. And typically this is priced at around $30 to $32 a bottle. So again, trying to make a good production whiskey, a solid foundation in flavor, and something that's a go-to. But if you're looking for those like kind of rare, hard to get whiskeys or those dusty bottles, this has only been around for about 3 years, with our contract extending probably back closer to 5-6 years in making the liquid. We have a rye. The rye is also at 101 proof, and that's a 95.5 rye. If you read the back of this, it would say that the mash bill is 70% corn, 21% of a rye, and 9% malted barley, which is similar to a mash bill that we specify or we like to get from MGP for our copper and cask, but this is entirely made at the Green River Distillery in Kentucky. Aged there as well. So it's only in the final couple months when we do the batching that they send it up, and typically we're under probably about 40 or 50 barrels. So relatively small batch, but it's not the mega brands that you've seen out there. And this was line priced. I think it just went up $1 or $2, but typically you could find it for $29.99 or less on the shelf. And for 101 proof with some good pedigree, you will see changes across the batches, but I think that that's a little bit of the fun too. So, yeah.
So speaking about the batches, I'm going to give you guys some flowers, because your first batch got us as number 19 on Whiskey Advocate Top 20 list last year. Was it last year or 2 years ago?
Yes, it was probably closer to 2 because they released the list last year.
Yeah.
But
so
top 20 whiskeys and 94 points. But you don't drink points. So, you know, we feel proud of the points and the ranking, but you know, it really matters what's in the actual glass and how you are identifying with it. So age now currently from everything in the bourbon is 4 years and older. So a few batches back, we were at 3.5-ish with some 4-year product in it. But at this point, we now have enough aged product to do 4 or older as we move forward, because we've been aging consistently from several years back with our contracts. Yeah, thank you for the comments.
I agree with Matt. Matt says that the cinnamon note stands out. That's what I picked up as well when I was tasting it. Is it fruity? Yeah, but to me, on a palate at least, it's a bit spicier. So there's a normally when you know something, or at least when I know something, and then when I try to taste it, like if there is a continuation from the nose to the palate. Like I personally view it as a good thing. Sometimes there is a disparity which can catch you off guard in a good way, and sometimes it does in a bad way. I think your bourbon is quite consistent, but like from the nose to the palate, there is this disparity. On the nose, it's a bit fruity, and then when you go to the palate, you get that spice burst.
So again, one of these harder things to do, as we get into the copper and cask, you're going to see how we can really play with flavor and take it into a bunch of different directions. But this particular one, we're just trying to make something that would be in your bar, that you would go to a barbecue or a picnic or with friends, and just have a good tasting bourbon that doesn't break the wallet, but also you would feel comfortable being able to mix cocktails and things with. Yeah. So, all right. So the third one is going to be Hunt and Gather. And I'm going to show you the two versions that we've ever released. Hunt and Gather 1, which has like an embossed metal label, which was a nightmare because I had to hand sand all of those metal labels to get the burnished look. This one is a 15-year Kentucky straight bourbon. This was on the shelf at about $100, and it sold out within a couple weeks. We have an NDA on both this and the Hunt and Gather 2, which is what's in your glass before you. But that set the tone for our old and rare kind of source whiskey that we found. And this has gotten much harder to find, although we do have some 20-year rye and some other things that are kind of in the works. But at this point, there's no plans to release a Hunt and Gather 3. The new bottle design for 2, which is in your glasses before you, also says 15 years, and it says Canadian whiskey. So a lot of people thought that this was a Canadian rye. But in Canada, they make 4 styles of whiskey. They make a barley or malted whiskey. They make a rye whiskey. They make a wheat whiskey, and they make a corn whiskey as completely separate distillates. They age them, and then when they make their blends, like Crown or Canadian, other blends that you might see, they're going to take those barrels and then mix them together already finished. So it's not typically done as a mash bill. And what's interesting was when there was a rye shortage back 2010 to 12, a lot of people went north, Whistle Pig and other great brands, and found source whiskey in Canada because they were not selling it as well as they had perhaps in the 70s, and they were just pulling the rye out. But when I found this particular one, I wasn't trying to do a bourbon, but this is probably about 95, 96% corn. So it is not a virgin charred barrel. And as a result, it's a 15-year Canadian whiskey with a corn foundation that I think is pretty delicious, but it's not typical to bourbon. And one of the things that we ran into was that people who had bought the first version thought we were going to just keep releasing different versions of the Kentucky bourbon. And there was a discussion about an aged rum. There was some other stuff that we had to take it out of the category. In the future, we may have a specialty version of our Northcross in an aged or special casking with a limited run that might be Hunt and Gather 3 or 4 or whatever the number is. But this one surprised a lot of people and typically was out on the shelf at under $70 a bottle. And there's still product out there and around because most retailers and most customers do not know what they're looking at when they see it. They think it's going to be a Canadian blend or they think it's going to be a rye whiskey. But until you taste this, this is what I call a whiskey for non-bourbon drinkers. People who don't like that wood spice, that intensity of that kind of heat. This is still 120 proof, but the heat on it is masked because it's well integrated with the flavor, and it has almost like dessert-like notes like creme brulee or lighter, kind of just delightful dessert notes without any of the heavy intensity of the burn or the wood spice that dries the sides or backs of the tongue. So this is out there, and we've used this as a foundation on a lot of our finished whiskeys. And so if you ever run into the Cask Finished series from Copper and Cask, we took the 15-year Canadian and then finished it in tawny port or Oloroso or cognac or Armagnac or Sauterne, and we put out releases of the copper and cask with these cask finishes that did very, very well because it showcases the additional flavors. And one of the first things that I always get a question about is, are you trying to hide flaws by finishing? Like, are you putting it in a sherry cask to kind of cover up something that you don't want to taste? And the answer is, if you're doing that, if a company is doing that, they're doing it incorrectly, because it will typically just accentuate the flaw. On this one, it's a light sweetness. It's nice. It's drinkable. It's almost dangerously smooth for the proof strength that it is. But it also takes those additional flavors into very different directions. The tawny port ended up over here, but the Oloroso sherry here and the Sauterne over here. So it really showcased a lot of our flavors. And we've gone through a lot of this product. But one of the things that I found is it's still out in the market, mostly because retailers don't know how to sell it. They just don't know what they're sitting on. So, yeah.
Rob, is there any finishing to this? People are saying, well, not people, Rob's saying there might be a mild Amburana taste to this.
No, this is the actual natural taste in the hunt and gather. So I'm going to, give me just a quick second. I'm going to walk over here. So one of the questions was, this is almost exclusively ex-bourbon, but we don't have a lot of data on this. It was made in a distillery in Alberta, Canada. So there's only one distillery in Alberta, Canada, but they did not release a lot of the mash bill. So when I'm telling you that it's a high corn with probably a little bit of malted barley to start the fermentation conversion process, you can see it's relatively light in color. And I'm going to guess that it is almost exclusively ex-bourbon cask. It makes sense with the pricing, the color, the flavor, without the intensity of that first use wood. But yeah, and like I said, when we released this was at $70. When a lot of other people come out with a 15-year product, it doesn't matter what it is, you're starting to look at 120 plus. And you know, like, again, I think a lot of people overlook this, but it is still out there in some of the stores, mostly because the retailers were expecting to have the pull through of the sale of the 15-year bourbon, which kind of sold itself in the frenzy of the bourbon, but then got left behind because the retailer wasn't able to position it or talk about it as easily. Yeah. And there's a question about Found North. Found North, great guys. Taylor Brothers, who I've worked with in the past, do a great job. But their sourcing and do have a considerable difference in the price. But you know, it's their model. I mean, that's how they're having to pay for it. It's how they have to clear it to make their brands. We sat on this for probably a little bit longer than we would have liked to, in the sense that if it cleared out, we could then get the money back in to start our next project. But yeah, it's just a different animal. And I included in the tasting when we were talking about what the lineup would be, because I think people who are in whiskey clubs and people who are in the know, that once they taste it, and they like to do like a little search or find some of that unusual stuff before this goes away 100%, it's still out there. And sometimes between 70, 80, 90 bucks, depending on if the retailer is trying to get their money out by, in my estimation, charging on the higher end of things. But I know definitely I saw it in some of the New York market at about $70, $75 in several stores, because they just did not know what they were sitting on. When we've done it as a copper and cask with the finish, and I held up the Sixth Sense, which is our cask finish 06. If you look on the label, it says CF06, Sixth Sense. This is finished in a sherry cask. And I'm holding up a bottle. You can look on the back, it says, this, I don't know if people geek out on this stuff, but this never went out because this is an Oloroso sherry cask, but on the front, we made a typo, and this is a typo that says cognac cask finish on the Sixth Sense, but we recalled those. I kept a handful of the bottles because the liquid was just as good. I just always think it's funny that we had the mistake. So you're seeing something that you probably could not find in the market, but you know, it's just one of those small producer things that we had to recall. It didn't even go out when we were putting the labels on. We're like, ooh, you know, and so we just stopped at that point and got new labels printed. And then I kept a couple bottles with the old label.
Randall, this seems like a good segue onto the copper cask samples that we have. But before we get there, let me ask you this. So your first hunt and gather release obviously got swept from the shelves
Yes.
with the bourbon hype. Your second one is super delicious, and there are still bottles in some select markets, some select retailers. We don't have any, but you might still be able to find some.
Yeah.
What is your plan for this particular line? Are you going to do the third one? And how do you I guess, pit whiskey with the brand?
Yeah. Hunt and Gather 2 was probably one of the last things for a short time or for a while, because sourcing whiskey has just gotten so prohibitively expensive. We came in and got this right during COVID, essentially. And after that, there was such a frenzy for allocated source stuff, people trying to find the rare and hard to find stuff, that the prices went through the roof, but more importantly, availability is just not out there. So kudos to the Taylor brothers with their Found North product, because they're pulling some stuff that we don't even necessarily have access to. So when we find the next project and it makes sense to release it, but currently we're concentrating on our Northcross, Wheel Horse, and Copper and Cask brands, specifically because we do have a source of liquid and we're doing well with those. We could spend a ton of money and try and chase another Hunt and Gather release, but I think that having it in some of the stores still almost a year and a half after it was released was disappointing to the company. Although I still think it's one of the best whiskeys for the value that you can find out there. But to hear from retailers that they're still sitting on product is disappointing to us from a company model, because it means they're not getting their money out of what they've invested in to have it on the shelf.
It also means they're not pulling it through. So
right.
You can look at it both ways, but I get it.
Well, after the success of the first one, I think everyone thought that anything that we put out in Hunt and Gather was going to blow out. And if you were paying attention, you're still getting great bottles of this Hunt and Gather 2, but they kind of want to regroup the wagons and try and find the next big thing. And it could be one of our versions, like a special edition of the Northcross. It might be a very, very special edition of just a handful of single barrels with, you know, unique aging for Wheel Horse, or it could be this 20-year rye that I'm working with right now in some finishes. But to be determined, and not on the books for the next 6 to 8 months that we know of. So
okay. All right. Well, with that being said, let's move on, I guess, to the next tier of samples. If everything we've tasted so far was, you know, good to pretty good, what you're about to taste is just going to be excellent. But you'll be the judge of that, I guess.
Right. So we're moving into our brand called Copper and Cask, and Copper and Cask is sourced whiskeys, sometimes with finishes, sometimes just unique in the way that we've sourced it and aged it. But which one do we want to start with? Did we want to start with Prime Barrel?
No, let's keep both Prime Barrel barrels as two last ones we taste. So let's go with yours, Barrel Select one.
So the Legacy Project, this one. Okay, so I'm going to show you your label. This is going to confuse you for a second. This is a full label, and like I was saying before, I don't know why I'm not focusing, but on the full label, there's a front, there's a down low with the name, the age, the kind of where it was from, where it was aged. There's also a I don't know why it's not focusing. Okay, there we go. Probably a little bit better, but harsher light. So you can see that there's the Copper and Cask logo.
There you go.
Okay, that's better. What I'm going to hold up now is going to be a sample, because this is not finished, but I put a label onto it to indicate that this is a legacy project, but you can see the code on the top here. So when this is bottled, it'll have the full set of labels. And one of the things that's really cool about our labeling system is that I try and be educational, not just transparent. So, but this black label indicates that it is a Barrel Master Select or Legacy Project. And this particular one is LP Legacy Project 363. Now the number is proprietary to the barrel. So there will only be one 363. And this particular one, I can tell you a little bit of the information in the mash bill on it, but let me pull up the book for it. 363, when it originally arrived to us, so this is my logs for when I brought in the product. We generate a page for each one, and then we generate an origin sample that goes out to kits, or if people are tasting, you can see the origin samples on the table behind me, kind of on the shelf here. And you can walk up and taste from the different products, or I could start to move some of them into this, which is our project 363. And this was a July 13th barreling. So it came out of the distillery on July 13th of 2016. It has a 21% mash bill. It arrived to us at 122.3 proof. And it has a fairly large fill because I can tell by the volume of the dipstick and the weight of the barrel. So I log all these barrels behind you and generate essentially an origin sample. That origin sample will then go into kits, and it's also how we decide when it's finished for aging, because I will do progressive, smaller samples, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, and so I can make sure that it's progressing the way that we want it to. A lot of folks will just put it in 2 months, 6 months, just to put a timer on it. And then when it's done, they think it's done. But I find that we get the best results when we kind of taste through and do some of this stuff with these samples. And you can kind of see that on the rack behind us. But if you look closely, these are going to have the finish. And this is sample number 4 in the series. And of course, number 5, harder to see the yellow in the background. And this particular one, we took a 21% rye bourbon. So a bourbon with a lower kind of rye mash bill, but not wheated. And then aged that in a virgin toasted oak barrel. And I can kind of try and show you this off to the side. But these red saran wrapped barrels or shrink wrap barrels are virgin toasted oak casks that have previously are a wine size. So our kind of little trick or secret is we get a 59-gallon wine toasted oak virgin barrel. The quality of the barrels is better. It's slightly larger size. And then we empty our 53-gallon American Standard bourbon barrel from MGP into that. We age it to taste with the toast. I then took it out of the toasted and then put it into a Caribbean rum cask for the finish of the flavor on that. So this has been pulled and it's now in a stainless barrel, which is what we do when we're done with the aging portion. I don't know if folks can see the stainless here. It's heavy to move barrels, but if you want to stop the aging, you can either bottle it, which is problematic if everything is unlabeled and looks the same color as every other whiskey in the warehouse, or keep it in a separate barrel before we prepare it to be bottled. So let's take a little sample of this. This is currently at, I believe, close to 120 proof as well. But if you have a good integration of flavors, you will not have that burn. So double finish, this will be released and I think made available to you folks. But right now, I'm getting a little bit of that Caribbean rum sweetness on the nose, a little bit of that hint of that smoke, that vanilla, that marshmallow, a lot of those stuff from the toasted barrel. And then what I think is a pretty delicious, at this point now, 7-year bourbon. So enjoy.
Randall, as people are enjoying this, and they will enjoy this, I think it bears to explain what your legacy project actually is and different delineations within the copper and cask line that you have. So like the double casking, legacy project, and just straight up, single
Yeah,
barrels.
so this is going to be probably, if we are going to do it as a legacy project with our barrel being the legacy project. I'll explain that in just a second, but it'll go under that designation because this is a very famous release that came out a little while ago that sold out. And that release is called Legendary Rye, which was a 95.5 rye that was finished in a 51.49 rye barrel. So we finished a rye in a rye barrel, but it was a different mash bill. And so it added small amounts of subtlety and flavor to it. And that was like one of our favorite barrel master picks, at least one of mine. I'm a big fan of our rye whiskeys. And so this was just definitely something that was interesting. But for the sake of everybody listening, if we do a legacy project, I know of no other companies doing this, we could take, for example, your Buffalo Trace or Four Roses barrel, and then your pick, if it was this 363 or whatever your pick was off the table, finish it in your barrel. So the concept basically is you sold out of your fantastic Four Roses product, and now you want to kind of kiss that flavor or that legacy into our brand. We can't label it as such. We take your barrel, we age it in there, we get it to the point where we think it's going to taste good, send samples if that's possible, and then bottle it and then send your barrel back to you. But a lot of people are seeing this kind of technique done with beers and other uses of their bourbon barrels that they're lending out to other businesses to put a finish and keep your story going along. Because when you're in a club or when you're a retailer that's doing single barrel, it's what happens is the propulsion of the whiskey or the selling of the whiskey happens because you have a good connection and a good story. And we've had tremendous success with what we call the Legacy Project, which is allowing your story at Prime Barrel to meld with our current projects. And so there's currently a Legacy Project that's in the works for you folks. We'll talk about that in just a second. But that is what the LP or the Legacy Project series is about. I can answer questions. We can't, because of trademark reasons, print it on the bottle, but we're happy to have you tell the story of what the pedigree of the barrel was. Some people have taken and done a syrup, maple syrup from Vermont, then aged their whiskey, then took that barrel back, and there's one actually back in the corner with the red bung on the top in front of those cases of Buddy's vodka. And that currently has some Moxie soda that's being aged in the barrel before we debarrel the soda, reduce it to a syrup for a bitter, and then fill that with a rye to give a kind of Moxie and rye cocktail kind of finish to it. So I'm always trying to push the envelope on what we can do with flavor. And a lot of it is not just throwing it into a barrel and setting a timer, but it's kind of revisiting and going back and forth with it to taste it and constantly measure where it is before it's released. Yeah.
If you people are kind of like checking what they just heard about the Moxie, yes, it is Moxie. Yes, it is delicious. No, the Moxie itself will not be available. It will be a Moxie finished whiskey product, but the Moxie itself will be reduced to bitters. And I already have a couple of people, Randall, that want to buy the bitters. So
yeah, I mean, this will be released through a retailer. This is their project. And
right.
Obviously, you don't copy somebody else's project, but we encourage you to be creative with how you're propelling your story or your experiments forward. So I wanted to mention one of the other legacy projects that we did with a retailer and their club. And about 2 years ago, they were having a discussion in the club about how much oxygen or headroom in the bottle, how it could oxidize and put an off flavor in it. And was I worried with some of our lower yield barrels that have leaked or have evaporated a lot? Am I worried with it having extra headroom in there? And I was saying no, but you should do the experiment to see, to satisfy this for the club. So they filled that 15-year Canadian into a Blanton's barrel that they had, kept it in for 6 months full, on winter solstice, bottled half of it, and then left half of it, half empty barrel, or half a headroom, half of that 15-year-old product for another 6 months, and then bottled that. And then they sold that as summer solstice and bundled the two bottles together so people could compare to see what oxygen inside a barrel at half the barrel for 6 months did. And it made some pretty fantastic flavors. And generally speaking, everybody liked the summer solstice, the second one with the oxygenated in the barrel, more than the winter solstice. But this is how you can get creative when you have a rectifying license, which is what we have, and we can continue to make and play with the flavor that you have in the whiskeys as well.
And that is a great segue, Randall. Before we kind of delve into the last two samples, which are Prime Barrel Selections, I'll say this, and there is a little bit of a backstory, as any good bourbon, as any good expression, I think should have an interesting story behind it. Sometimes it's just pure marketing. Sometimes there's really something behind there. This project and this release that we're about to taste, the Double Cask Rye, goes back more than a year now. We selected it about a year ago. Obviously, we're sent samples prior to that. So it's a long time coming. And Latitude, Randal, and his, I guess, partner, they were always on the same wavelength with us in terms of trying to do something unique in the space that hasn't really been innovating all that much in the last however long, right? And as we were trying to build out our membership program, and we were trying to kind of create or marry, I should say, two worlds that don't necessarily have a lot of overlap, that being, NFT, crypto side of things, and bourbon, we wanted to, I guess, create a perfect spirit that would embody what the Prime Barrel is. That being, it's tasty, but just unique enough for you to kind of have on your shelf and be proud of it and share with your bourbon friends. So that was number one. Number two, we asked them to do a custom label for us, and that doesn't normally happen for any bourbon club, let alone a budding one. They kind of understood our vision and agreed to do it, and it came out awesome. It just came out great. It's even better in person when you see the bottle. So this particular release has a lot of sentimental value to me personally and to us as a club. I think once you try the sample, I'm eager to find out your feedback, because we obviously love it, but we want to see what you think of it. And so with that being said, let's dive into it. Let's taste it, and let's see what you guys think.
So just to answer a quick question, proof on the double aged, it is close to 120, but we'll have to pull the actual hydrometer reading before we do the final labeling and process a little bit. But I'm going to hold up your special custom label. And typically our labels are a solid color and look like this, right? And this is black. There's blue for bourbons and green for rye. But this one has that special kind of background picture inside of it. And then as I get a little bit closer, you're seeing this as labeled as DC 119. So DC 119 is double cask 119. It is a rye. So as we look on the back, it has the mash bill, right? It has when it went into the barrel, when it was bottled. It's from Lawrenceburg, Indiana. So this is MGP product. And so what you're going to see here is a 7-year rye, 54.6%. So 119 proof on this one as well. Unless it 109, excuse me, on this one as well. And so let's give it a little bit of a taste, and I'll explain why it's labeled as a DC or a double cask. So,
and there's another thing I want to say about this barrel. So as you guys probably can tell by now, Randal knows his way around single barrels, and he can probably identify the winners versus something that would go into the blend. This particular barrel was actually earmarked for their own release. And they had a misfortune, I guess, or a mistake of sending us a sample of it. And the entire lot was actually pretty solid, but that stood out to us. And so when we called back and we said, hey, we want to pick this barrel, they're like, well, we don't know about this one. We might keep the barrel to ourselves. So it took a bit of buttering back and forth, but they mercifully released the barrel to us, and which is what you are drinking today as a single barrel.
Right. So we started with barrel number 100 in our numbering. And so this was the 19th barrel we got. And in the first lot, when we were buying stuff from MGP, I noticed that a lot of them were what they called a re-barrel on the label, meaning that the barrel had leaked, or there was a flaw, or it was evaporatively losing a lot of liquid. So they took it out of the initial virgin charred cask and then re-barreled it at the MGP distillery in a toasted oak barrel that they had waiting for some of these accidents. When you're doing hundreds of thousands of barrels a year, they have a back stock of these toasted barrels. So by default, it went into a second cask, not because we chose to, but because it was losing some of the liquid at MGP, and they just put it into another barrel. What happened was when a lot of people were trying to buy or source their whiskey from MGP, they were passing on these barrels because they thought that they were going to be awful or have a bad taste. But anytime you're going to use two types of different barrel aging as part of the core product, I'm like, oh, this is going to be interesting. At least I can work with this. And so I found this one, and Michael was right. This was one that I was going to release for my own Barrel Master release of this for the company. And they kind of, they snaked it out from underneath us. But I'm happy to share it with you because it is delicious. And what really we're trying to do is get great product to consumers. And I'm not going to buy the whole barrel. So I'm glad that it landed in a place that I think you're going to enjoy it. Legs for days on it if you're using a Glencairn glass. And then the other thing that I like to do with ryes, and it's kind of a term that I don't think a lot of people are familiar with, but like a juicy IPA, I like the ryes to be juicy. Instead of astringent and down the middle of the palate or tongue with a little bit of burn or a kind of a watery harshness, I like it to be mouth-watering, round around the entire palate, and just giving a juicy kind of sweetness, that mint, some of the other pepper kind of notes, but all coming together as a complete package that makes it very tasty to drink neat. And I drink almost everything neat, but you know, we've heard that a lot of people are doing some fantastic cocktails with these kind of flavors. But again, I'm more worried about how it tastes unadulterated without mixers or other things in it. So this one, yeah, enjoy.
What are we thinking?
I'll just add in this as people are writing their comments and stuff in. I hear from retailers all the time that rye does not sell as well as bourbon, but it's a different animal. It's not trying to be the same thing. And for most people with a good bourbon palate, you're going to evolve to some of the richer flavors that I think you're seeing in the rye if it's done well. You'll still love your bourbons. They'll still be fantastic, but this is a different kind of expression. And I think it's the evolution of your taste because you're going to be seeking something with a little bit more dimension than just the corn and some of the other mash bills that you would get with the typical bourbon. There's a comment about a cold weather drink, but I would challenge people to try and find some ways to make this, because summer to me is almost like that minty menthol, a little bit of that spice, but it's mouth-watering to me. So yeah.
Yeah, this one, I mean, like I said in the beginning, this is a prototypical Prime Barrel where it could definitely be viewed as an oddball in more than one sense. But there are different types of oddballs in my estimation. You can have a polarizing, liquid, and I would venture to say most Amburana releases would be polarizing. It's not for everybody. This one is unique in that it's not your typical rye and it's not your typical bourbon. It's a liquid in and of itself. It's one of one, and that's exactly what we wanted. Like, we love this barrel. We really did. I'm very proud of it. Like I said, it has a lot of sentimental value to all of us. So I hope you guys like it.
Each time I drink it, I'm just a little sad that we didn't get to release it, but I'm glad that you guys were able to pick it up. I think it's fantastic. Judging
by the comments, people are digging it. Again, I certainly not going to hold it against you if you don't like it. But I think majority of people do enjoy it, which I'm glad to see. And that's actually a good segue into the last sample. And so the last sample, there's also a little bit of a backstory behind it. When we were there in that facility that Randal is sitting in right now, about a month ago, maybe a little more than that, it was unique in a lot of ways. There was no power in the building, so we had to do everything in the dark, including shooting some of the videos that we recorded with Randal for the Prime Barrel Academy, which, by the way, was his idea. They came out great, and they'll share some links for you to watch later. By the way, if you want to watch, how they approach the whole finishing process, Randal goes into it in a lot of detail in one of those videos. But that was unique, and so we kind of like, we had the class, we had the shooting, and then we walking around the warehouse and drinking out of the barrels and tasting some of these bottles that he's got sitting on that table behind him in complete dark. And we weren't really planning on selecting anything on that trip. And a few people that were there with us, our members,
brought a sample to me and said, "Hey, Michael, you got to taste this." And they did it separately. It's not like it was the group of people that were doing it at the same time. They all done it separately, and they've all brought the same sample to me. So one thing I've noticed right off the bat, even before tasting it, how dark the juice was, how dark the color was. And then I tasted it, and it was fantastic. And so we ended up getting the barrel, but we have interesting plans for it, right? So there's a reason, I think, why it's a little darker than everything else that it's on your table right now. Reason being, this particular barrel was aged, right? It was aged in Florida, right? So it's a completely different climate, obviously humid, obviously hot, and you don't see a lot of bourbons being, aged in Florida. So that kind of gave it a uniqueness, not necessarily enough to pick a barrel, but the taste, slayed us. It was fantastic on its own as it is. But the plan is, so we actually going to do a few interesting things with it. We're going to split this barrel into probably 2, maybe 3 ways, and basically release a mini project of the same barrel. One would be released as is, right? Essentially what you're drinking right now, this is what it's going to be bottled at. The second one, we want to extend a life of this very special barrel, Four Roses, that we recently selected in Kentucky. So not every day you get an opportunity to select a 16, almost 17-year-old Four Roses barrel. And so we want to, extend a life of that barrel because the whiskey was just amazing. And we want to see what happens when you pour this fantastic whiskey into the fantastic Four Roses barrel and see what happens to it. So we're going to do that as a legacy project that Randal talked about. And if they let us, we're going to do the exact same thing with the New Riff 9-year-old bourbon, which both of these things are charity barrels. Both of these things are one of one. No one else in the world has those. And we want to extend the life of those barrels if we can and see what happens to the whiskey. So that's the plan. When it will come to fruition, I don't know. Like, it's ready when it's ready. But this is what we have cooking for you guys. So I kind of wanted to share that.
Yeah. I'm going to back up for a quick second. And I'm going to show you a typical bottle. This was done for the New Jersey market called the Garden State. And it is labeled as MK469. Another one that was a Barrel Master release called Got the Mott's, because it has an Mott's applesauce type flavor, in my opinion, is MI, and the barrel number is 189. So a question was, what is double cask? Double cask is if we've used more than one cask, and at MGP, they took it out of the original charred virgin barrel. This is the last one that we had tasted, the Prime Barrel pick. And then they added it into a toasted oak barrel. And instead of putting rebarrel, which most people would not understand, we designated it as a double cask. If I do a finishing at the warehouse, like a rum in a rye cask, it will often get the DC designation as well. But what you're seeing in this particular sample is MF. And the code that you just saw, MI is MGP, aged in Indiana. MK is MGP, aged at a distillery in Kentucky. And then this MF is MGP, aged into, and I have it written because the label hasn't been printed yet. MF7868 is the barrel number, and it's a MGP liquid, but aged in Florida. It is moved almost immediately after it is put into the bottle, and excuse me, after it's put into the barrel to the location. So if it stays at Indiana, the MI ones, they'll be there for its life until it gets sent to our warehouse before we put the sample kits out. If it has MK, it's gone immediately to Kentucky for aging in a rickhouse there, and tends to be these rack style with the on the side top. And then a lot of the Florida stuff we got was palletized. So if you see in that back rack under the, sorry, I'm doing this all backwards, but you can see some stuff kind of on shelving, like Home Depot shelving. Those are some of the Florida aged ones. And it was aged at a Florida warehouse in Central Florida, just outside of Orlando. However, we do have an NDA from that distillery who let us use the space there, but does not want us to reveal the source. You can probably find it pretty easily. They make a great, they're known for rum. So anyway, as you know, some
Somebody said Disney?
yeah, Disney,
Not-
much as they like to make money, tends to do it around family-oriented products that aren't alcohol. But yeah, I think this is, so anyway, the two things that we noticed, and if we had a better lighting in here and we were closer to this
That's
shelving
fire.
behind us, you would see that even for the same age in the Kentucky, the darker, it's much darker. So I'm going to show you, I don't know if the light will work very well here, but this is about the same age as the Florida, but the Florida one is,
Damn.
is much
Yeah.
darker. And in your small sample, it's not going to show as dark as the full bottle.
Nah.
You've noticed that it's darker across the board. The barrels look like they've been set on fire. They're like kind of crusty and burnt looking, but that's also typical of Caribbean rum barrels that have used an ex-bourbon cask. This is still first use bourbon, but the wood just looks very, like the ones back here look relatively clean, but the ones from Florida were dark black or brown. Typically, I could use a Sharpie marker to write onto the barrel head, but on the Florida ones, we had to use chalk because you couldn't see the marker against the dark background. Anyway, the other thing that also happened was the proof went up by about 3 or 4 points. So our typical Kentucky, same age, same mash bill, might be at 118, but most of these were breaking 120 points. And this one is not on the hotter side. And then when I say that, it's at about 118, but it's gained a point or two being in our warehouse between when we received it and we're about to bottle it as well. So I don't know. I can't tell you in terms of fact anything other than it seems to have a tendency to get darker. The proof seems to go up, and the flavor seems to be relatively unique from the exact same mash bill that's aged in Kentucky. But enjoy, and yeah, we'll hear your comments. So
People are, I think, geeking out over this barrel, which I don't blame them. That's exactly what happened when we visited you. Like I said, we weren't planning on picking anything, but then when we tasted it, like we had to get it. And you know, the fact that it's Florida aged, I haven't came across anything that was Florida aged before, so that was kind of unique. And oh, by the way, this is an 8-year-old bourbon that you guys are drinking, so it's not every day that you get an 8-year-old barrel, right? Most of them are what, 4 or 5 years old, so it's double the age. So all in all, I think it's a winner for sure. And I can't wait to kind of release it and see what happens to it when we add it to secondary casks. Not that it needs it, but I think it could be enhanced even further. So we'll see.
So this is going to go into different, you're going to add it to other.
So if I had it my way, and Randal and company might curb my enthusiasm there, but if I had it my way, we would split it 3 ways, right? A third of it would be released as is. Another third would be put into a Four Roses charity barrel, and then the last third would be put into a New Riff charity barrel. And we'll let them marinate in those 2 charity barrels for a little while and then bottle them. And so you'll have almost 3 different expressions from one barrel. Make sense?
That
and
would
you'll be able
great.
to buy it in the straightforward version,
Right.
but so see how the other things have taken it in a different direction. Yeah, I think that there is a question up that within a few weeks of it being put into the barrel, it was shipped to Florida or to Kentucky or stayed in the Indiana warehouse up until probably about a month before we waited with this still in the barrel because the aging date changed in end of June, if I remember correctly. I can look this up, but I'd have to dig out some paperwork on it. But basically, it changed in the aging because it was put in the barrel in June, but it was only in our warehouse for about 3.5, 4 weeks. The rest of the time it's spent in Florida. I would prefer that everything stay as long as it could in the regions or the areas that we're aging it in. But at some point, I can't go down to Florida or Kentucky and pull samples to then begin to show them to your club or to a retailer. So we do bring them up to this warehouse, and yeah, May 28th. Okay, so we had just, this one I think you sampled on Father's Day, so almost a month after
Correct.
it changed over. But we had gotten that barrel in early May or middle May, actually. And so it spent almost its entire life in Florida. And just the last few months, when we get this out, bottle it, and trying to do that. And yeah, so I'm going to see if there's ongoing experiments that we do, and we can age in, for example, you know, Arizona or something that might have a unique environment that could change stuff, because I do see a difference in a lot of the Texas aged product in terms of the wood spice. They also use different size barrels and other things as well. But I'm fascinated now with the uniqueness of where you're aging the process. We'll always designate the origin distillery, that's the M, or for all these it's MGP, although we do have a few things that are not MGP. There's some stuff from Bardstown, Kentucky. There's that Canadian 15 that we've used. There was 12-year-old Kentucky Spirit. There was other things that we have. But generally speaking, for our production run of Copper and Cask, most of it is coming out of MGP.
So Ralph asked, will the 2 or 3 expressions be released at the same time? No. The plan is, so obviously as is version will be available probably sooner than the others. So we'll probably drop that on you guys sooner, and then the other 2 perhaps be released together almost as a bundle, even though we're not going to bundle them together, but you can buy it at the same time. Yeah, that's the plan. We'll see what happens, you know, as they say, best laid plans, right? So
Right.
we'll see how they progress in barrels.
Right.
And
so the max bill on the Florida is the 21% rye, 9% malted barley, and 70% corn. The rye whiskey with your Prime Barrel is 95 rye, 5% malted barley. And then the first one that we were playing with, which was the toasted oak, and then in the rum cask, let me just verify that I believe that that's also 21% as well. So yes, it is. Yeah.
I would also suggest you guys dropping maybe a couple drops of water into that last thing. I normally personally drink everything neat, but this one definitely benefits from a couple drops of water. It just becomes a different whiskey in a good way. It just opens up flavors even further. So try that. One of the questions I was also asked, how long would we want to keep them in those secondary casks? I honestly don't know. I think this would be one of those things where we kind of like use time units. And again, you'll know what that means if you watch the video that we shot with Randal. But it basically becomes a pull and taste, right? And so if Randal tells us, hey guys, I think this is ready, we'll get some samples sent to us, or maybe come down or come up, I should say, and taste it in person. And then if it's ready, that's when we're going to bottle. So I don't have a time frame. Randal, I don't know if you have any insight into like how long typically it ages in a secondary bourbon cask, but I don't know.
Yeah. So, I mean, my company constantly is like, we need to know, is it 2 months? Is it 4 months? I've seen results in 3 weeks that I thought were phenomenal, and we were ready to bottle. And then I've had stuff that was in a sister cask from the same Armagnac distillery that is in there for almost 11 months now and still has not turned the corner into what I would think would be great to bottle. So, long answer for a very short, real answer, which is each one has to speak to the people who are going to buy it, bottle it, or do whatever. And so the way that I do that is that I will probably pull these on a weekly basis. And if it was something I was a little bit more comfortable with, like a rye in a rum barrel, I might do that every 2 weeks. But on this particular one, I'm going to do it every week. And at some point, I will figure out that it's starting to, it'll go through an awkward stage where the flavors aren't really mixed together well. And then it'll start to come into its own. And then I'm going to guess that we'll try and leave the third one for a little bit longer to showcase just additional aging, or release one of them, the third one, if it finishes faster than the second one. I let it kind of speak to me. And while we'll be able to communicate with the club or with Michael about when that is going to happen, at some point, I will probably have you guys pull the trigger and then move it into the stainless barrel so that it kind of stops the aging. Because the real danger is if it's right on the edge of turning past when it was good, and it doesn't get awful, but it just gets less good. I want to stop that immediately, and that stainless will do that. And there's no real air circulating in that barrel. If you go to pull that what's called a sanitary fitting off instead of the bung, you really have to work at it because it gets such a pressure differential inside the barrel that it's not getting any liquid interacting with oxygen that's freely circulating. So I'm not trying to talk around the question. If the barrel's ready in a week, we'll do it in a week. If it's a couple months. But generally speaking, with a used barrel, Four Roses and New Riff being empty, maybe still a little bit wet, but like generally speaking, no real product in them, I think you're going to look at a couple months before you start seeing some good results.
Yeah, I'll say one other thing, and for the people that kind of know my palate and have been on picks with me personally, I tend to stay away from anything that's over oaked. That's just not my thing. So we'll definitely not let it over oak, and try to preserve the fantastic flavor you're tasting today, and perhaps it just gets enhanced.
The secondary cask will generally release smaller, more subtle types of flavor into a whiskey, whereas like a first use cognac cask after the cognac has been emptied will tend to pour a lot more intense notes in it. So your Four Roses barrel and your New Riff barrel, if those are the ones that we use, will tend to do small, subtle layers of flavor, which you'll definitely taste between the origin or the unfinished barrel sample, but it will be in like a little bit more of a subtle and kind of introduce some of the things that made those whiskeys great, hopefully into the one that we're aging in there as well. We've not had a barrel that I've felt has been bad that we've released. So we're getting really positive results from a lot of this.
All right, let me share my screen. As I said, this survey is commingled with the first group that had an opportunity to taste these. So this is an overall score, and let's just go right down the list. We started with the Irish whiskey, and that got an average rating of 5.4, typical, bell distribution, so to speak. Some people thought it was average, some people didn't care for it, some people loved it. Overall, it's 5.4, 5 being an average score. So again, it stands to reason because most of us here are barrel proof drinkers, and perhaps it was lacking a bit of a punch, even though that whiskey was meant, I would venture to say, for a completely different demographic. Horse Bourbon, very close score, 5.5 as well. Again, most people actually did enjoy it. Some said it was average, some liked it a bit better. But there were some people that didn't really care for it. Not quite sure why, but it is what it is. If I had to venture a guess, I would say probably it was a bit more spicier and alcohol forward for them than they would probably were hoping for. But this is just conjecture on my part. Now we're moving on to the Hunt and Gather, the second one, much higher score, 7.3. Not a surprise there. Very unique whiskey, lots of 8s, lots of 9s, 110. So obviously it rubbed people the right way. So not surprised by the score at all. As we move on to Copper and Cask selections, the Barrel Master, the LP 363. People were very impartial to it. I say partial to it, I should say. Almost 8, 7.8, almost an 8 score. It's a pretty high score. For background, when we select barrels, we rarely score 8 or above. So this is a pretty high score. And then last two are the Prime Barrel picks. The one that goes on sale tomorrow for the general public, scored 8.0. They're a respectable score. And then the last one was probably the star of the show, almost a 9, which I haven't really seen the score that high, I think ever in these surveys. So that's saying something. So those are the results. I think it's pretty aligned with what you guys were thinking. All right. Well, Randal, thank you so much for your knowledge. If people didn't know who you were before, I think they do now. I really do hope that people watch those YouTube videos I've shared. They'll gain even more appreciation for your background and for what you know about whiskey in general. And hopefully this is not the last time we kind of collaborating and doing something exciting. So thank you so much for the samples. Thank you so much for your time doing it twice, once on a weekend. So, and thanks for everyone on the line. I hope this was fun for you guys, and you know, can't wait to get those whiskeys into your hands. So cheers. Have a great night.